Hey everybody, I am back. So I am here once again to talk about pretty much anything on this list. I am a philosopher and psychologist. I do work in the psychology of metaethics. So the main thing I study is whether or not non-philosophers are moral realists or moral anti-realists, or whether they're neither. And I actually argue that they're neither. And a big point I make in my research, and this is something that a conclusion that I came to after studying this topic for a while, a lot of these questions that researchers pose to people that don't really have any training in philosophy, they'll ask them questions like, do you endorse this view or that view of free will or morality or whatever? Now, they don't explicitly say, like, do you endorse a compatibilist conception of free will? Because people aren't going to know what that means, but they use sort of indirect and roundabout ways to figure out if people endorse these views or have intuitions in favor of these views. And the whole thing is there's something questionable about that. They seem to be presupposing that people are disposed to think in line with the way that philosophers think. And I'm not sure that they do. To give a comparison, it's a comparison I use in my work. Most people probably haven't really thought very much about how to interpret quantum mechanics. So there's different interpretations of what's really going on with quantum mechanics. You have the Copenhagen interpretation, the many worlds, the Bohm or hidden variable interpretation. So there's a variety of interpretations. Now, if you went out and you ask people, like, which interpretation do you endorse? They're going to be like, what? I don't endorse any of them. And the reason they don't endorse any of them is because everyday discussions about causal events and those sorts of things just don't draw on the complex mathematics of quantum mechanics. So they just don't need those concepts. They don't need to have a view on that to talk about those sorts of things. And I think that this generally extends over to issues in philosophy, like free will and metaethics. So that's what I like to do, but I also talk about other stuff. So I started up doing lives here, what is it, a couple weeks ago? Yeah, a couple weeks ago. And the main thing I talk about is whether or not moral realism is true. So I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't believe that there are any objective moral facts. If you look in the academic literature on this topic, the term that's increasingly seeing usage is the claim that there are stance independent moral facts. And what that means might sound complicated, but and maybe there's like really complicated ways of talking about different types of grounding and everything. There's always complicated stuff when you scratch the surface. But in simple terms, it's just like, hey, there are facts about what's morally right or wrong or good or bad, and they're not made true by cultures or individuals. They're not a matter of preference. They're not a matter of societies getting together and agreeing on the moral facts or the moral rules. The moral rules are in a certain sense true out there in the world in the way that maybe mathematical facts or scientific facts are true. Like, we don't make it true that the periodic table has the composition that it has, that this particular element has this particular amount of protons in it or whatever. We don't prefer that carbon has a particular mass and therefore it does. We discover that's the case. And moral realism treats morality very much the same way. We discover what the moral facts are. We don't invent them. So that's a big topic for me. I see a moral realist in the chat. They said, moral realist checking in. You have a great stream, even if we're on different places on the topic. Appreciate it. Thank you. So that's a big topic for me, and that's an area I study. So my background is in psychology. So I have a PhD in psychology, but I work a lot in this area called experimental philosophy. So I do interdisciplinary research. I mix the two. I do philosophy and psychology, and my big thing is metaethics. So that's like the abstract study of morality. Like moral realism is being probably being the biggest topic, but there's others. But I will talk about other topics too, free will being one of them, the existence of God. But I should note, I am not an expert. I'm not even much of a novice in philosophy of religion. I don't know a lot about Christian scripture. I read the Bible many, many years ago, when I was very young, so I don't remember. My retention of what I read isn't very good, but most people's probably isn't very good. So, don't expect me to be able to talk about the sorts of topics that Danny talks about, Danny from Phil Talk, when it comes to philosophy of religion. Danny knows a lot more than I do, and there's a lot of people out there who are super knowledgeable about that topic, but I do my best. But yeah, if you want to request, if you disagree with me, if you think God exists, if you think we have free will, if you think there's objective morality, you're welcome to talk about that. I did mention yesterday that I also have concerns about the current peer review system in academia. I think there's a lot of problems with it. I certainly, when you criticize the peer review system, sometimes people take that to mean that you don't think that experts should evaluate one another's work and that we should do some degree of consensus building and mutually checking one another's work for quality and research integrity and that sort of stuff. I certainly think we should do that. But the current system that we have has a lot of problems. So right now you're seeing a lot of issues with peer review just taking a very long time. It's hard to get the relevant experts. I don't know if people know this, but not only are you not paid for publishing papers, you often have to pay to publish your papers. And the people that review them are not typically paid, or they're not paid very much to review the papers. So it's largely volunteer labor. Now, I know some people think that well, you're doing what's good for your profession or discipline or whatever. And that's true. But I do have concerns with the current structure and setup. I mean, among other things, there's not a lot of formal quality control in the quality of reviews. And one thing that people that work in academia have noted is the wide variability in the quality of a review. Many reviewers are very diligent. They take their time. They really put a lot of effort, maybe too much effort, into writing a really good, comprehensive, thoughtful review. And at other times, they will write a few sentences. And often reviewers get really mean, because they have a certain degree of anonymity much of the time. They can take advantage of that. Anyway, so I'm wondering if this background doesn't make clear what my position on these issues is, so people may see it, and then I'm experimenting with different backgrounds. So morality, free will. I'm not saying what I think about them, which maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it makes people more likely to join, because then they could take whatever position they want on the matter. But maybe I should try to prompt more disagreement. I see a ridiculous question in the comments. What is your favorite cookie? I actually do have a favorite cookie, and it's a chocolate chip peanut butter cookie. So I really, really, really love like Reese's and peanut butter cups and anything that's chocolate peanut butter related. So that's my favorite type of cookie. I really love cookies. I make them on occasion, and I do a little bit of baking. My wife does more baking because she got way better at piping icing and stuff than me, but we do a little bit of baking. So that's an interesting question. What's your take on abortion? I don't talk a lot about applied ethics or normative ethics. So I don't know if I want to break into that topic, especially because abortion starts pushing up against political stuff, and that's not my thing. I think when people get into those topics, they tend to be polarizing and heated, and I want to avoid those kinds of conversations. So I think I won't really address that particular question. I'm glad you understand. Thank you. Yeah. So the person that asked me that said no problem. I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, it might be something as I get more comfortable on this platform and other platforms, I might eventually delve into those topics, but I don't know if I'm up for that yet. It's not that I don't think I can discuss them. I think I already made it. Like the issue is when you get into topics like that, the way that people go about discussing them changes. People's vibe changes, their mentality changes, their disposition changes. You dredge up a lot of aspects of humanity that I want to exclude from the way that I'm discussing things. I want to keep discussions in a more neutral space, I guess. So, Hardly Grown, are you the one that asked me about cookies? It's actually a question to measure who you are and if I want to engage with you. How do you judge that on the basis of what someone's favorite cookie is? Can you explain the reasoning behind that? Someone asked, maybe you're not in your wheelhouse, but did you have any thoughts about the so-called science wars of the 90s? What are the science wars of the 90s? I remember that there used to be this big attempt at introducing like creationism or like through intelligent design in schools. Are you referring to that or something else? I was pretty young at the time. Someone just says, hey, Lance, hello. Someone else says, yo, it's Lance, hi. Yeah, if you disagree with me on any of the topics on the screen, just come on up. I'm waiting to get a stand because I kept having to set the stand will set my phone up against my microphone, and it kept falling over. So I got to stand. I think it's arriving today. I could actually check. So that's why I don't have the camera on, because I was tired of it falling over and it being really goofy. Someone said, I would say social bio, but that was like 70s. Yeah, that was before I was born. So, Hardly Grown, you commented on the other person's cookie preference by saying that sounds awesome, but I didn't see you comment on mine. Do you have a problem with peanut butter? Disagree with what? Yeah, that's the problem with these prompts. I'm not saying what my view is on these issues in the questions. I wanted it to be readable, but maybe I just need to state my stance. So I'll go through them all. I am a moral anti-realist when it comes to morality. I don't believe that there are stance-independent moral facts. If you disagree, you can request. I don't believe in free will. It's a little hard to summarize my position on the matter, but if you think we do have free will, I'd be happy to talk to you. Depending on what you think about what free will is, I may end up agreeing with you. I don't have a huge problem with accepting certain conceptions of free will. And I don't believe in God. I am an atheist. I believe that gods don't exist. So if you disagree with me about that, I'd be happy to talk. The big issue I've been focusing on lately is the problem of evil. And in particular, I have trouble understanding how, and maybe this is something that a theist could convince me of, that how you can square the existence of suffering with an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being. Just, I don't see how those would follow. Like how you would have that such a being, and then there would be suffering in the world. And I mean any suffering, but especially like seemingly gratuitous and unnecessary suffering. Of course, someone could say, well, maybe the suffering is necessary for some greater good. So I do know that gives theists a sort of escape hatch, some type of skeptical theist thing. Okay, let's see. Somebody said, not creationism, but very academic debate about science's claim to objectivity. No, I don't know anything about that particular dispute. If you want to tell me a bit more about it, maybe that's hard to do in the comments here. And how it compares with other ways of knowing. I just don't know much about that dispute. Most people will not answer the question and act very stuck up. If you are chill, you will engage. I see. I love all cookies, but chocolate chips are chocolate. Yeah, so chocolate chip is very respectable, but I want a little extra oomph in my cookie. And when I make cookies, the most common cookie I make is chocolate chip cookies. But I like them with a little bit of I like the mini Reese's, not just adding peanut butter, which is fine. But I like to add little mini Reese's to them. I think those are the best cookies. I especially like, because the other thing that matters about cookies is the texture of the cookie. So I don't like I don't like a cookie that snaps when you bite into it, like gingerbread or something. I don't want it to be crisp, but I also don't want the cookie to be super duper crumbly. I like when a cookie is slightly firm and with a little bit of crisp on the outside, but then it has the warm gooey center. That's the best. I want it to be almost brownie-like in the interior. It has a somewhat different texture than brownies. I also really love brownies, and they're also easy to make, which makes brownies like the MVP of desserts, because it takes 4 seconds to mix everything together. But my favorite dessert is, and I don't know if people are familiar with this, it's called a kanafa. It's a Middle Eastern dessert. It's got shredded phyllo dough, and then you have a cheese, and it may sound strange to people to have a cheese in a dessert. But so you got this cheese, and it's usually made flat on a tray. The ones I've seen a lot are circular, but it could be in a square tray too, and then you just use a pizza cutter to slice pieces of it. So it's got this cheese, and then it's got the phyllo dough, and then you have crushed pistachio, and then you put various syrups and flavors on it. Rose water is common, orange blossom water. There are other flavors I guess you could use. I've seen people sprinkle pomegranate on top. There's probably other flavors you could add if you want to do it unconventional. That would be really good. But and then you basically just bake it in the oven, and you get this the cheese doesn't totally melt down, but it gets softer, and the whole thing, it's got a crunch, it's got a cheesiness, it's got a sweetness. Absolutely love it. That's my favorite dessert. I don't see it in restaurants in the United States as much as I would like, and it's pretty hard to make because it's hard to get a hold of the cheese. I've had it made with mozzarella before, and it didn't work out super great, and it's okay. But yeah, that's my favorite dessert. I don't know what you got me talking about desserts. I get really excited about food. So if you get me going on food, I'll talk about food way more than philosophy. Chuppy says, I believe I don't have enough followers. I think you need 200 unless they change things. It seems like TikTok changes things around a lot. You'd love my chocolate chip cookies. Took years to refine the recipe. Yeah, I see a request. I'm going to just get through the comments and I'll get to that. Those are facts. Okay. You love my chocolate chip cookie. Took years. Yeah, I love to try out new recipes. I mess up cookies all the time because I get impatient with various features of like how you mix them and if you leave it in the fridge and that kind of thing. And I always end up doing something goofy, being impatient, and then mess them up. I don't have a huge problem with dialetheism in principle, which might sound bananas to people. Someone says, "Are you taking requests?" I have some questions. Yes, I am. I'm just trying to get through the comments. At some point it's going to be impossible to get through the comments when they're whizzing by, so I'd like to do it while I still can. Oh, add cookies to this bullet point. I should do that. You know what? I will do that. Okay, let me take the request. Hey, how's it going? Are you here to talk about cookies?
Sure. Um, so I just kind of popped in. I was just catching the middle of the type of cookies that you were talking about. But yeah, I like it where it's kind of like, I guess you're meaning more of kind of like not so chewy, but just more of like, because like I don't like super chewy cookies either. Like you don't want them too crunchy, but you don't want them to crumble. But then chewy, the texture is off.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by like, because there's chewy like food that you actually have to chew, 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 chew to get it down. That would be an awful cookie, like a rubbery cookie.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not what I mean. I'm talking about like it's. I would have to. The best way to demonstrate, it's like very hard to articulate the texture of food. We don't have a good vocabulary for it. Maybe
Well,
chefs
I
do,
think when
but
you said brownie, so I like envision a brownie like somebody like
mhm.
kind of pulling apart a brownie. So
Yeah.
is that weird to like visualize how the texture would be?
I think visual aspects of texture matter a lot. You know, I watch a lot of baking shows, like a British baking show and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And my wife and I we watch like every season, and we got to the point where when we see them slice into a cake or we see a bread, we're like underproved, overproved, and we've
Hmm.
gotten pretty good. I haven't kept track, but we're pretty good at them saying that cake is dry or that cake is too crumbly, and so it looks like we can visually spot better than chance. So we're
Yeah.
pretty proud of ourselves.
Yeah. It's pretty bummer when you see this beautiful cake done and then when they cut into it and it's like, yeah, that's not good. It's like really,
Yeah.
or like the worst is like if it's really dry or like lacks
Yeah, dry
flavor.
cake is terrible. You can always fix it with syrup, but you know, one thing is I've gotten more familiar with cakes from Brazil, and they have a lot of
Hmm.
layers and a lot of fillings. And
Yeah.
it's
Hmm.
something strange about American cakes is there's often no filling, and it's just a ton of buttercream icing on the outside, and then you just have cake, cake, cake. I don't get it. Put fillings in.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone said you should add a bullet about cookies
Yeah, I might do
to your
that, but I'm
topic.
assuming you didn't actually come here to talk about cookies. Did you have
No,
something else you
I
want to talk
didn't.
about?
No, yeah, I was gonna ask you actually ask you, Lance. So I kind of seen some lives and everything, and I was like looking at your profile, and so you have a PhD in psychology.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay, so and this is gonna be weird. So I'm not like necessarily asking for career advice, but just kind of like get an idea of your experience because I'm getting ready to graduate with my master's in rehabilitation counseling, and I'm considering going for a PhD in psychology. So I was just kind of like, it's just a thought, and I'm kind of trying to figure out, get some perspective on what that might look like. Because some of the other people in here have PhDs, but they're not in that field. So I was just trying to maybe get your perspective on your
Sure.
experience.
The first thing I
Gooey
should note
said,
though.
Amber, cook him. I'm not going to cook Lance on anything. And trust me, he's way smarter than I am.
So
So,
are you considering going into clinical psychology or some type of experimental or research focused psychology?
well, so from what I understand, typically PhD programs tend to focus or lean more towards research based, but I really kind of want to still have that patient engage or client engagement. So I'm thinking more clinical.
Gotcha. So what I do need to note about that is that So both my undergrad and my PhD in psychology were entirely oriented towards like theoretical and research based stuff. I have
Hmm.
absolutely no training in clinical psychology. Don't I don't work with patients. I don't have training in that. I didn't even take like intro to abnormal psych. So I don't really have substantive knowledge of that sort of branch of things, the sort of medical, therapeutic, and applied side. And so that would
Yeah.
really limit the kind of insights I could provide if that's the kind of career path you're considering.
Okay. Well, I do. I mean, I am really interested in the research aspect. I just was trying to see if there was a way to find a balance where I didn't lose the patient connection, lose those skills.
Gotcha. Yeah, there are people that are they're clinical psychologists that nothing about that prevents them from also doing research. I mean, clearly,
Hmm.
obviously people do research on how to do therapy better. So, people do all kinds like people do both. So
So it's
if you
just
have
kind
any
of more of a
specific
path,
questions.
which path I kind of want to. So you're saying I really kind of need to decide which path I kind of want to lean more towards. Um, so what was your experience doing more of kind of the research based?
So
Or
the area I was in is social and personality psychology, although most of the people were specifically did social psychology. So that really focuses on looking at sort of, I guess you could say, population level behavioral tendencies in people,
mhm.
and so it's really not looking at like clinical or therapeutic type stuff.
Okay.
It's also sort of somewhere between being applied and not applied. So social psychologists, it's a lot of the sort of stuff that you see in pop psychology. So like stuff like nudges and although it bleeds into behavioral economics in some of that research. A lot of social psychologists are interested in stereotyping, prejudice, that sort of behavior. So you could see how
Mhm.
that could have some applied aspects. My work tends towards the more theoretical and shades into philosophical stuff. So a lot of my work, because it's in moral psychology, it falls within the scope of social psychology. But what ended up happening with me is I became increasingly skeptical of the measures and tools used in social psychology. And this is one thing I should definitely ask how familiar you are with it. Are you familiar with something that's been going on for not quite 15 years now, but what's called the replication crisis?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so the replication crisis, it kind of got sparked by this paper that was published in a major psychology journal. And it was a paper that presented, I believe, 11 studies purporting to show evidence of human precognition, that humans could slightly see into the future.
Hmm.
And it was accepted in the journal despite, and there's nothing, it I don't know if it should have been accepted or not. I don't think I would have accepted it. But the problem is that the conclusion is pretty far fetched. And I don't personally have any problem in principle with people doing that kind of research, like on ESP and that sort of stuff. But
Hmm.
what it revealed is that one could, in principle, find seemingly significant statistical evidence for all sorts of claims that we might think, you know, our prior probability for them is extremely low. And that started to raise questions about what was going on in psychology. Now, psychologists have been aware of these issues for a while, but this just somehow got the ball rolling on people starting to point out huge problems. So there's been a few, I say a few, there's been a mountain of developments since then. But one big one was in 2015, a massive team of researchers selected three top journals in psychology. They took 100 studies from those journals and they put together a bunch of teams to each attempt to replicate those studies. Now, there are problems with
Hmm.
some of the replications. In some cases, they made too many changes and it's questionable whether they really did a great job of replicating the study as closely as they should have. But what
Hmm.
they found is out of the 100 studies, only 36 of those studies were statistically significant, I think, in the same direction as the original study. So, in other words, the
Oh, okay.
replication rate was about one third.
Oh,
And
okay. Gotcha.
that's really, really, really bad. And so the field has been undergoing a sort of a crisis of many, many findings are getting overturned as significant efforts to reevaluate previous paradigms and research are turning up. Yep, that effect doesn't seem to be real. Oh, that effect doesn't seem to be real. And the field, I have a pretty pessimistic outlook. I don't think that we know a whole lot about human social psychology. I think most of the findings are probably false. And that's a problem.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So
Interesting.
I don't know how that interfaces. What I should say though is some people might see that and go, oh, that's a reason to avoid the field. But I didn't
Hmm.
leave. I see, like, human social behavior is really, really interesting. Human behavior is interesting more generally. I want to understand it. It just turns out to be a lot more challenging and complicated than we realized. And
Right.
it's going to take a lot more work. And I'd like to do that work. So anyway, I remember where I wanted to go with this. My own work shifted towards methodology itself. So now I do stuff that's a lot more meta scientific. A lot of my studies are actually meta studies. They're designed to evaluate the efficacy of studies themselves. And so my
Oh,
research
okay.
ended up becoming really, really abstract. And
Hmm.
I don't know if my experience doing that, how that relates to what your interests are.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think yeah, and that's why I kind of really kind of want to get more of what your background was and kind of get a feel since you're kind of in the same field I am. I think I definitely probably would stick more with the clinical
Mm-hmm.
aspect of it because I definitely want to keep the skills of because I'm really into or I'm really interested in being able to administer assessments and kind of I know that a lot of these assessments can whether or not they're valid and reliable it kind of there's always a new one and this one's outdated and but I think I kind of really want to be able to keep that aspect of working with clients and evaluating them on an individual basis.
Yeah, well, I think the best thing to do in that case, if you wanted to get direct feedback, would be to talk to people that do work more closely related to that. Like, I'm happy to give you what insights I can about my own experience. I have to be wary, especially, one of the things I've had to condition myself to do is if you say you have a PhD in psychology, a lot of people will think that that might mean that you have knowledge of like diagnosing mental illness and that sort of thing.
Right.
I have none. I have no qualifications for doing that, and I understand you're not doing that, but there's an audience here, so I want to make sure they know that too.
Oh yeah,
That
definitely. And
is
I make
not
that
the kind of training I
clear
have.
when like I talk about, my particular like cuz my master's degree, mine is
Hmm.
specifically in rehabilitation counseling. Mine is very specific to working with the people with disabilities
Gotcha.
to get them reintegrated into the workforce. So mine's very specific. So while I do delve into counseling theories and things of that nature, even my knowledge is limited on the diagnostics and assessments. So I try to be like, there's an intuition from experience, but I try to be like, look, guys, I'm not licensed. I can't give you, this is not a
Gotcha.
diagnosis. This is a feeling I have that, it's kind of like a preemptive diagnosis. It's a feeling I have, but I can't, diagnose you. So I always try to make that very clear. Um,
Yeah, I wish I had, and maybe this is something I should start making a list of like resources. People ask me for book recommendations and stuff to say, hey, go check this out or go check that out. What I can say is my general impression is that there there is an increasing desire for people to, work on their mental health and
mhm.
in various ways. And this would be true of people managing any other a variety of issues. It doesn't have to be just counseling. And I have found that there's less availability than there is demand. Like
Right,
people need more therapy than they're able to obtain.
right,
And so I would say it seems like a field where more people in the field would be a good thing. So there is that. When you do the kind of weird abstract research I do, there's this constant sense of, is this really worthwhile? Am I
hmm
actually doing anything useful for society? Whereas someone that is helping people in the way that you have training to do, it's like, of course that's valuable. Like there's,
Well, no,
so I
I
often
think
feel a little
it's all in
self-conscious.
like I think it's because even though you work in kind of a more broader abstract area, it's still I feel like that is an important component because then you're working on making sure that there when we do these studies and post our findings that the studies are are valid and reliable so that the data that I eventually will get and use is reliable. So I feel like there's a trickle down effect.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, but that can be a tough argument to make. So if I'm saying,
Yeah.
hey, this particular measure in this particular study in this obscure journal isn't a very good measure, here's six problems with it. Like, yeah, hopefully, if more people do that kind of work, it will trickle down. And if I didn't think that it did, I wouldn't do the. If I thought everything I did was totally futile and pointless, I wouldn't do it.
Right.
But it's often hard to, among other things, it's very hard for me to get funding. So,
Mm,
if you're doing work on, curing cancer or treating illnesses in a direct way, I'm not saying it's easy to get funding, but the case you can make for getting for like, hey, here's why you should give me funding, that resonates with people more than, hey, I want to figure out if, people can understand version 17 of this question about whether they're moral realists or not. It's much harder to pitch that to people that decide whether to give you a grant or not. And
right.
I could complain about it, and I will, but I also totally understand where they're coming from. It's not so obvious to draw the inferential path from that to actually helping people. And I think that I should have, enough humility to recognize that maybe I am wasting my time on some of these things.
I'm not trying to give you an existential crisis, I promise. I just had
Oh, no, no, no.
questions.
This is stuff you deal with the whole time.
Yeah, yeah.
Look,
You're kind
what?
of like, is what I'm doing making a difference? Am I making any kind of impact?
Right.
It's like almost, do you feel like you're spinning your wheels sometimes?
Yeah. And, the other thing I should say is people's experiences from what I've seen from people doing PhDs is highly variable. So a few things I could say
Mm,
is who your advisor is matters. How well you match with your advisor also matters. So it's not like
okay.
advisors aren't one size fits all. Some
Right.
advisors are more hands-on and they like to say, hey, here's what I think you should be doing. And they play a more active role. Others are more hands-off. Different approaches, I think, work differently for different people. I'm more of a, like, you know, give me support and then let me do my thing kind of person. And so that worked well for me.
Hmm.
But it doesn't, you have to be mindful that like who your advisor is actually matters. So that's, I think, solid general advice for anybody getting a PhD, pretty much in anything. Uh, so that would be one thing. The other is that the level of stress you end up experiencing can be really variable. So my experience
Mm,
ended up being very high stress, not because of the program itself, but because of what was going on in my life around the program. My life
hmm.
got very challenging right when I was entering my dissertation phase, and that ended up dragging it out. I feel like, I see pictures from myself from 2019 or 2020, right before I really started diving into writing the dissertation. And
Hmm.
then I see pictures afterwards, and I've compared it before to like when you see like a president, like a president enters office and
Oh
they look
yeah,
real
when you
young and then
see,
they leave.
yeah, when that you see how much the stress of the job has aged them.
Right. And they look like they're 20 years older. And you're like, it was 4 years. What happened? That's I look at myself now. I'm like, so my beard started turning white. And I'm at 35. I don't know if that's super early or old, but I just look older. I see a few more wrinkles. And I'm just like, oh, it. So for me, and that's another thing I would say is if you end up doing a PhD and you're doing a dissertation,
Hmm.
listen to your committee and your advisors, because the advice I kept getting is write a concise, straightforward dissertation, do what you need to do to finish. It's no, you don't have to make it the work of a lifetime. And
Gotcha.
I didn't do that. I turned my dissertation into I kept comparing it. I was in this like fevered phase of writing. I don't know why I'm going with alliteration there. Fevered phase, where I kept saying it's like a hydra. Every time I write one thing, I feel like I need to write two more things. So
Hmm.
I ended up writing so much that I threw a bunch of it into supplemental sections, and I ended up having this monstrously long dissertation. You don't
Oh,
need to do
okay,
that.
gotcha. Yeah.
It's not as much work as that. But I went way overboard, so don't do that. Don't take on too much work.
Hmm.
Other than that, I don't know. It
No,
was
that's
rough.
that's that's really good, really good advice, especially, for us, and we're not young spring chickens. I'm 43, so we're not young spring chickens anymore. And when you're got family obligations and children and things of that nature. So see, like, yeah, so I got my bachelor's in social work like 20 years ago. I hate saying that out loud, but I got it like 20 years ago. And so, where the job where I'm at now, they actually paid for me to get my master's. It was a requirement of the job. So they paid for it. So there was this huge gap. And I'm a much different student now at 43 than I was at 23. So it
Hmm.
hasn't been the easiest, it wasn't the easiest route. The motivation
Yeah,
was, and the energy was not there like it was 20 years ago.
yeah, I definitely get that. I just had a friend complete their PhD, and they're in their, I can't remember how old they are, but I think they're in their early 40s, and they got through it, and they got kids and they got all that stuff. So people can do it.
Oh yeah.
What basically what I would say is, it's tough to get in. The work can be tough, but if you're the kind of person that got in, you're the kind of person typically that can do the work. And
Mm-hmm.
what can happen is if you're very self-driven, you could take on more work than you really need to do to finish, and there's no benefit to doing that. So the
Gotcha.
benefit for me was like I felt proud of myself for doing so much, but if you get overly invested in a project, you're like, how many people are going to read your dissertation? Probably not very many people. So what I would
Yeah.
say is don't overwork yourself. A lot of the stress people experience can be self-imposed, and it could be alleviated by stepping back and taking advice from other people.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, I was like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I think the last time you were busy, you were talking to Brody, and I was like, oh man, I have to catch Lance next time and just ask him. Um, but no, I really appreciate it. And I think I killed your lie because like you had 20 some people in here. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So
I want to be open to talking about a range of topics. I'm not just going to sit here and try to like topic optimize. So if people drop out, then that's their choice.
yeah. Well, I really appreciate it, Lance. Thank you for your time and kind of your actually. I
Yep.
think the advice you gave me that was really yeah. Definitely don't because I'm definitely somebody that overanalyzes and overthinks and should I have done more? Should I have added more? Should I and so that's definitely good advice to kind of keep in mind if I pursue that
All
path.
right.
All righty,
Well,
thank you
I
so
hope
much,
that was
Lance.
helpful.
Yeah,
Hmm.
definitely.
See you around.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. We have our next requester. Just as a reminder to everybody else, the topics are like morality. I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't believe in objective morality. I don't believe in free will. I don't believe in God. And I'm open to talking about a wide variety of things in philosophy and psychology. I mostly know stuff about metaethics and a bit of psychology stuff. I don't know a whole lot about a whole lot else. Hi, Dano.
Yeah, hey Lance, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Let me preface this by saying if this is too elementary for you or your chat, you can shoo me away and I will not be offended. But this is also an engagement purely for my own desire to learn and not necessarily debate and recognize, what your expertise are. Um, and if I may, I'd like to just share a little bit of context of this engagement here before the questions so you can
Sure,
understand
go
the
for it.
why. Okay. So, at the very least, I consider myself agnostic, but if not, pretty strongly atheist. And so, I tend to lean more towards my understanding of moral anti-realism. Um, and I'm just hoping to clear up some confusion that I have as I think about, ethical framework within, those that the information that I just shared. So if I understand moral anti-realism correctly, that being that there's no objective moral standards, it tends to pull me, and I know that I'm probably like skipping over a ton, but it tends to kind of pull me towards cultural relativism, which I'm inclined to feel is very problematic. Um, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, how to hang myself to an ethical framework that tends to draw from moral anti-realism, but understand how to do so without falling into cultural relativism and so in other words, like, um, if I'm a if I'm a moral anti-realist and I don't want to be a cultural relativist, at least in my understanding of those terms, how then, do, what is then available to sort of establish an ethical framework?
Gotcha. Okay. Um, so I guess that one way we could start is by you telling me a bit about how you understand what would you say moral anti-realism is, what cultural relativism is, and why you feel like you're kind of getting drawn towards cultural relativism in particular.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And again, this is elementary understanding. I don't have much, academic. experience in this. So, I understand that moral anti-realism understands that there's no objective moral standards, right? And I'm not religious, so I certainly wouldn't say God sort of establishes moral standards that are objective and that govern regardless of what culture, regardless of what time or what have you. Um, and so, again, my understanding of moral anti-realism is that then, therefore, morality is subjective. Um, and so, but then if it's subjective, then I start to concern myself with like, well, then what establishes my own sort of moral principles? And I don't, I feel that then sort of pulls me to cultural relativism, because if there's not an objective moral standard, um, is it then subject to some sort of relativism? But I'm thinking of it less to the individual, but more to the sort of cultural societal level. So then, how can a society or a culture establish a sense of moral subjective truth without falling into moral relativism, or is it just simply not possible?
Gotcha. Yeah. Why cultural relativism in particular? Why not be, for instance, an individual subjectivist and hold that moral claims are true or false relative to each individual standards?
I guess my hang up there is uh, I'm sorry, you said individual
Subjectivism.
subjectivism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess my hang up there is how does individual subjectivism lead to, you know, um, like how is that managed within a society? If everyone were a individual subjectivist, does that create sort of moral issues and practical issues of how people, sort of applied ethics of like how people can live life if we're all individual subjectivists? And so it sort of then, because I'm not able to answer that question, it's sort of then, well, then do you then, how is then the culture or society governed from a moral or ethical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, one consideration to keep in mind is that even if people are individual subjectivists, often there'll be a lot of overlap and agreement on much of what falls within the scope of moral consideration. So, if you take people in the United States, they certainly do not agree on what normative moral standards we should all live by. People disagree on abortion, they disagree on all manner of hot button issues. People are divided internally within cultures, and yet and sometimes those cultures have conflicts and they break out into violence and that sort of thing. But people still largely get along and live together to a certain degree. And they do that in spite of having different moral standards. And part of what you should note about that is that for the most part, people agree on stuff like we shouldn't just allow everybody randomly to steal whatever they want. We shouldn't just allow random violence just because people want to commit violence. So people that live within functioning societies tend to agree on a lot more than they disagree. And so even if we thought, yeah, moral facts are facts about individual values, as long as individuals actually share largely overlapping values, that still allows for those people to live together without too much conflict. But the other thing to note about a kind of subjective view is it's not like if you're a subjectivist or a cultural relativist, you have to prescribe anything substantive. So a lot of times moral realists will depict subjectivism and relativism in ways that are semi-realist in nature because they project or import or bring in a lot of the stuff that realists believe in. So someone might say, if you're a cultural relativist, then you ought to comply with the standards of your culture independent of whether you want to. Your culture standards somehow fix or determine what's morally right or wrong for you in a way that has the same, or not, I shouldn't say the same, but a similar kind of practical authority to moral realists. So moral realists might say, hey, the moral facts don't depend on your attitudes or values. And among other facts, that one of the moral facts is you ought to maximize utility or you shouldn't lie ever or something. And if that's the case, you shouldn't do it, even if you want to, even if it would further your interest or whatever. So if you endorse this kind of cultural relativism that has these semi-realist elements, you might also say, well, if your culture says that you should never lie, then that makes it the case that you should never lie, even if you don't want to. And I think that those kinds of conceptions of relativism and subjectivism, those are not the inevitable endpoint if you reject realism. I don't endorse those views. I think those views are silly and indefensible. And so, that being the case, a lot of the objections that people raise towards relativism and subjectivism at both the cultural and individual level focus on depicting these metaethical positions in ways that carry or include substantive normative implications or consequences that it's not conceptually necessary for versions of subjectivism and relativism to include. And I think that critics do this in a way, I don't know that it's intentional, but they do it in a way because it makes these positions easy to criticize. So I don't think you're stuck thinking that you're tangled up in all these conceptual problems if you reject realism.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I tend to believe, like, I don't. This may sound silly, but like, I I trust that people, in the long run and in mass, will do the right thing as time goes forward. Like, I have faith that humanity will find solutions to their problems without necessarily, latching on to some iteration of God, right? But at the same time, I also have this, like, one side of me wonders if the overlap, as you point out, like, if you have a culture like America, for example, if America were comprised of all of individual um, subjectivists, there would tend to be a lot of overlap in terms of how we decide what is right or wrong. There's a part of me that wonders, and I would hate for this to be true, but part of me wonders, is that because of the sort of insidious nature of the role that Christianity has played in informing our society of what's right or wrong. And so that leads me to wonder, how does the overlap of a group of individual subjectivists tend to, how does that happen if we're all given our own unfettered opportunity to develop what we think is subjectively right or wrong?
Yeah. I don't think, like, if you, well, there's a few things to say here. The first is endorsing the view that, for instance, moral claims only make sense as being relativistic. Like when I speak roughly like a subjectivist. So when I say that I think that unaliving people is bad, what I'm expressing there is something about my standards, my preferences, and my values. But what I'm not doing is saying, well, I use moral language this way and everyone else does. So everyone's a subjectivist, or this is the correct analysis of moral language. I'm not doing that. And you don't have to do that either. So my actual view on what most people, like, out in the world think about metaethics is that they don't think about metaethics. I don't think
Right.
they are subjectivists or relativists or realists or anything like that. I don't think everyday moral language is about metaethics or takes a stance on metaethics or expresses a metaethical view at all. And so I don't worry so much about the idea that people are subjectivists or some type of realist, because I don't think they're any of those things. And I think that these metaethical positions are largely esoteric, have very little to do with everyday moral practice, and just don't really impinge on everyday behavior in any substantive way. Now, I recognize that that might sound weird or like a very controversial position. It certainly is in academic circles. But I don't think people are subjectivists, so I don't worry about that too much.
Yeah, well, that's certainly helpful in my own sort of synthesizing the information. I guess the one hang up is the critic to that, or to me, because I agree, but then I hear sort of a moralist critic say, well, again, the only reason people tend to live their life with, to some degree, of peace and harmony is because, whether they recognize it or not, their sense of morality has been infiltrated by what has been an established sort of in America, sort of like largely a set of Christian moralist ideals. I don't know how to rebut that. Not to say there's not, much people much smarter than me can rebut that. I just personally don't know how to do that. And maybe I'm overthinking it, that like in the end of the day, humans will do, they will be able to understand right and wrong by themselves through their values, and that, there will inevitably be a lot of overlap. But again, to the sort of Christian moralist, you know, um, critiquing the way that I kind of see these things, I don't know how to, again, rebut like, yeah, well, you only think that way because whether you know it or not, the foundation of your morality is based on a stream of moralist Christian views by virtue of being raised within this culture, and whose parents and grandparents and great grandparents have done the same. So I guess what would be your rebut to that, if that?
I don't know if I would. I don't know if I would rebut that. I mean, maybe that's true. I think Christianity probably has influenced our moral values, but even if it has, like, so what?
So then they say that, well, then your subjectivism is just sort of a convenient way to avoid the the truth that, what led to you having the privilege of having this subjectivist view is actually Christian moral realism, and therefore you're just not there yet to join us over here.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard anyone say something like that, but I would have some concerns with that. I mean, one of those concerns is Christian moral realism. Where did they get that from? I don't think Christianity entails or requires moral realism. I've never seen anything in the Bible where it's like the moral facts are stance independently true. So I wouldn't buy any claim of Christians having some sort of monopoly on realism or any specific claim to realism. I don't. Where did they get that idea from? I think moral realism is something somewhat autonomous to Christianity and not really part of it. I don't know. So I would just challenge whether they have any sort of realist Christian values in the first place.
And I guess in my elementary understanding of moral realism, as it relates to Christianity, something like the Ten Commandments, bestowed to us by God, therefore establish some objective moral truths that help guide us. I'm not saying Christians do a good job of living into those commandments, or really any of the much of the objective moral truths that come out of, the Bible, but I guess I would use that as an example, and please correct me if I'm not looking at it right. But like, the teachings in the Bible, that is the way that I understand Christian moral objective truth. Is it not?
Uh, well, we would need. Can you hear me okay, by the way? I'm walking around, so I don't know if the mic is working well.
No, I can hear you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of issue where it's very hard to address because you're sort of discussing on behalf of somebody else.
Yeah.
What I would ask is, how do you get realism with Christianity? I don't think you get it for free. I don't think it's as easy to get it. Someone could point to the Ten Commandments. Okay, why should I think that? Okay, so you've got the Ten Commandments, and where are the stance-independent moral facts? If the Christian then wants to say, well, it's a stance-independent moral fact that you ought to comply with the Ten Commandments, where's that coming from? Is that in Scripture? Is that part of Christian doctrine? If so, which Christian doctrines? How do they know those doctrines are true? Even if they think that it's part of Christianity to be a realist, why should I think that realism is true? They would need to do all of the work to show that realism is true, and the work to show, if they really want to insist on it, that Christianity somehow entails or holds that it's true. And I haven't seen Christians do that in a convincing way.
Is the emphasis there on in a successful way, or are you saying like, Dano? I'm just not sure that that's how they argue this type of topic.
I do see a lot of Christians seem to just presuppose realism. And I've seen atheists and philosophers will say stuff like, theism pretty much entails moral realism, or Christianity pretty much guarantees moral realism, or if Christianity were true, moral realism would be true. So I see people making those claims. And I've asked around a bit, and again, I'm not a Bible scholar, I'm not a scripture scholar, I'm not a scholar of religion, but I don't know where they're getting that from. I don't know what that's based on. So if they're around, if they're in the audience, I'd love to talk to them. I don't see how you get moral realism out of Christianity. I just don't, and I've never seen it.
Wow. Wow. So then,
I should note there. If you look at the Phil Paper survey, that's a survey of philosophers.
Yep.
They about 15% of the theists that responded to that survey actually chose anti-realism. So and it's only 26% are anti-realists in general. So the rate doesn't even drop that much. Anti-realism seems to be, at least on the view of some philosophers, consistent with Christianity or theism. Probably most of those theists are. Well, I can't say most. It looks like there are Christians that are moral anti-realists. There are also at least some Christians that are moral skeptics. So David Pullman is not a moral realist, but is a Christian. And so there's an example. And there's at least some Christians that are skeptical that you get moral realism on the cheap with Christianity, if at all. So, I'm not the only person to raise this concern. There are others that have raised this concern that are themselves Christians. I think a lot of Christians have just sort of grafted contemporary Western philosophy onto Christianity in a way that I'm not sure that fit can be so readily read off their doctrines.
Yeah. One last question, I think. I sort of subscribe to, in the absence of a civilized society, and I guess for practical purposes, people that are sort of governed under within sort of some form of theism. I tend to subscribe to Hobbes's sort of stated nature, that in the absence of those things, people can find themselves to do pretty reprehensible things to each other, to themselves in general. And I guess, do we need, what then helps to protect against chaos from ensuing among a group of people, a society, a culture, without some form of established set of laws or some established moral framework?
You might very well need an established set of laws or moral framework, but I don't think that you need realism to get it. So I think that we could base laws and moral systems off of practical considerations without the need for thinking those considerations are true. Just take any domain in which someone wants to proceed in a practical way with respect to their goals and interests, and there will be facts about what would be conducive to those goals and interests. They're not obligated to comply with those facts if they don't want to. So generally speaking, if there's enough overlap in people's goals, interests, and values, they can construct systems to self-regulate, and they don't need those systems to be true. I don't know why it would matter if there were moral facts independent of what we want that were true. Like, so what? Why would you want to follow rules independent of whether they connected with your goals and desires in any particular way? The only rules I care about are rules that further my interests and goals. Now, some people, when they hear that, they hear egoism, they hear selfishness, they hear greed. And that's a very silly thing to infer from someone saying, I only act in accordance with my values, because what matters is what the content of those values are. A person's values could be things like, you should help everyone and care about everybody. And that's totally consistent with not being a moral realist. Being a moral anti-realist doesn't require that you be an egotist or selfish, right, or a psychopath or totally self-absorbed or have no altruism. It doesn't entail any of that. And so many critics of anti-realist positions seem to act like people would just be absolute monsters if they didn't think that there were these rules floating out in the ether. I think one thing to point out is that people that seem to endorse moral realism can act like monsters just as much as anybody else, because once you sort of outsource what regulates your behavior to the universe itself, If you become convinced that the universe demands of you that you do awful things and commit atrocities, people can be motivated to do that if they actually value complying with those facts. So moral realism is completely consistent with being an absolute monster. Um, so that that's an issue. So I don't think you need realism for that. I don't know what you do need, and it might be that there are certain uncomfortable truths about how to maintain societies and the structural integrity of a society and not have everything collapse. I don't think it would be a good idea to go around telling everybody in a community, live by whatever standard you please, be completely wanton and unconcerned about like anyone else's concerns. There's a big difference between thinking that there are no independently authoritative rules that govern how we ought to act independent of our goals and values, and the kind of caricature of there not being such a thing, which is that one should just be like a whimsical, self-absorbed bacchanalian maniac running around drinking to their heart's delight and not taking any responsibility for anything. That's not a requirement of rejecting realism.
So it seems like, as a matter of process, if a community of people wanted to, pursue self-determination and sovereignty, as a matter of process, understanding or establishing where that overlap may exist is a maybe an important prerequisite to then lead to the sort of laws that govern it, to then be able to identify or to, I guess, assuage those that interpret individual subjectivism to the extreme, and therefore fall into egoism and doing awful things. That process would help mitigate the infiltration of those types of agents within that group of people.
Can you rephrase that? I'm not sure I followed all of that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So it
No, no,
seems
it's all
like
good. It's all good.
if you have a community of people that are all individual subjectivists, right, and they
Mm-hmm.
they they want to sort of establish their own sense of culture or community. Let's just say hypothetically they wanted to become their own sovereign, community. It seems as a matter of process, establishing where those overlaps in terms of their individual subjectivist morals, um, where they align, would be an important um, process to then establish what laws would then govern that group, so to assuage the individual subjectivists within that community who feel like they can do and do whatever they want, to assuage those sort of out, again, individual subjectivists who want to do whatever they want, from doing those things. um, and I guess all of that word salad, to mean, it seems like the process of among a group of individual subjectivists to identify where those overlaps and moral truths lie is important to deter against the other individual subjectivists who may have foul intentions with their moral beliefs, from being able to actualize whatever it is they want to do.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's true. But what I would note, though, I mean, at least one thing I would note is I don't think most people are subjectivist or realists. So I got to stress that. I just don't think meta-ethical views play a big role in what people go about doing. So, a subjectivist might say, "Hey, I have different values than you, and I think my values are, I act in accordance with my values, you act in accordance with your values, and so we have a dispute." Realists just move the dispute from a conflict of what people want to a conflict of what they think is true. And so you get exactly like, look, you can have realists. One says it's an objective moral fact we should do this, and the other says no, it's an objective moral fact that we shouldn't do it. And the subjectivists, hey, I value X, and I recognize you value not X, so we have a conflict. So they're just a different kind of conflict, but practically they come out to roughly the same thing in practice. I can't stress enough how much I just don't think metaethics matters for everyday behavior. Just don't think it matters very much.
And so I guess a very last question: do you sort of share some version similar to me that, like, in the end, regardless of your knowledge of metaethics or morality, people will tend to do, um, will behave themselves in a way that sort of fosters um, progress, peace, harmony, like insert whatever sort of. I guess do you have that sort of faith in humanity?
I don't think so. No. I noticed what might be a tension in what you said because I thought you had also said that you kind of lean in a Hobbesian direction that they're like we're going to descend into a state of nature, but you also seem optimistic about humanity, and those seem at odds. Do you think there's a tension there, or can you square those, or did I misunderstand you?
No, 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 no. That's a great question because yes, I did say both of those things. You know, 20 years ago when I was in college, exploring political philosophy, I was very compelled by Hobbes' state of nature. I tended to agree with it that in the absence of something, we would just devolve into chaos, right? Chaos of self-interest. Um, and that self-interest run amok leads to then state of nature, right? I guess uh, having been pretty much atheist my whole life, the way that I squared that was that therein lies the purpose of government. Like therein lies the reason why we need to have a social contract that we all decide to align with, and therefore, some sort of theistic um, structure was not necessary. And so I guess, again, to me, the social contract is what helps square, while in some ways, I think, in the absence of either, in the absence of a social contract, humans left in the state of nature will devolve. Um, it's a defense of a social contract to deter us from that. And governing that social contract is a set of general values and ways that we're supposed to live our life. Does that make sense?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, I would have a bunch of questions that I'm not sure that we want to have that whole conversation now. I feel like we're kind of wrapping up. I mean, one of them is just like how literal or how metaphorical we're getting with social contracts. Like, I didn't literally sign a contract. I was born into the country I was born into. I got, my social security card, my birth certificate, and all this stuff. And I'm kind of just subject to laws I never sat down and agreed to. And so there's a certain sense in which social constructs are metaphorical. Like it's not like where we existed in a state of nature or an original position. We actually went through the constructive procedure of designing the societies that we live in. Rather, we're just sort of plopped into societies and we find ourselves in them. Although, on the other hand, someone might say that we tacitly condone the contracts that we're structurally, uh, uh, like there's a structure around us and we find ourselves in it. We comply with it. I try to follow the speed limit. I stop at red lights. I pay my taxes. And so I'm tacitly going along with all of these sort of contractual obligations that have been foisted on me. Does that mean I'm consenting to them? Well, it's hard to say because I didn't really have an option. For most of my life, we grow up in households where we don't have the freedom to leave. So there's a certain sense in which we are coerced into the lifestyles that we live and the societies that we live in and the contracts we find ourselves under that we never really opted into in a fully freely a freely made it's not the result of a freely made decision. And so reality doesn't really mirror the kinds of idealistic perfect conceptions that philosophers often come up with. And that disconnect may end up mattering. It may, because if that difference ends up mattering in how we judge the legitimacy of the state or the efficacy of the systems that we're in, doesn't the practical reality just trump all of the idealistic philosophical reflection on things if those things don't end up mirroring reality? I think this ends up being a kind of a serious problem for philosophy. How much can we really infer about whether or not this particular social system or law or norm is just or acceptable or good or whatever, by considering thought experiments? And I think this generalizes to philosophy as a whole: philosophy of mind, ethics, epistemology. We have all these thought experiments, and I worry that they require us to imagine situations that are so far removed from the practical realities that we're actually in, that they just might not be as informative as they seem to be.
I think that's a good stopping point. Lance, I really, really appreciate your time. If I had endless
Yeah.
resources, I would support you to be able to do what you're doing way much more. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no problem. Take care. All right, everybody. I don't see any other requests, and I'm also getting really hungry. So I think I may pop back in here, but for now, I am going to go make some. It's 2:30 here, so kind of late. So I'm going to go make some lunch. So I hope those are informative conversations. They weren't exactly the topics I typically go for, but I think that that's cool. I'm glad that people are comfortable talking about other topics. So if I do pop back in here, I might do something more focused. Like maybe I'll focus on the problem of suffering and evil or something like that. Anyway, I will catch you all later. And yeah, I'll see you again. Take care, everybody.